entirely directed towards reforming the parliamentary system, because it was thought that once you'd reformed the parliamentary system, then a properly representative parliament would enact legislation that would be protective of working people. Okay, so that was the idea behind it. In many ways, and this is a perverse thing, in many ways what Chartism represents is not a critique of liberalism, and this is my second stunning point about the 6 points of the Charter, is not a critique of liberalism, but actually a radicalization of it. It's saying, look, if you really believe in the principles of a liberal political representative system, then make it bloody representative. Make it represent us. Okay, so it's in some ways not a critique at all. It's a radicalization of the liberal project. Now, the strategy that they use, the Chartists use, in order to advance this manifesto and these goals was a combination of so-called moral and physical force, summarized in this fantastic catchphrase that they had, and obviously it was not a game show to be had, but it's peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. And the point here was that Chartism was going to provide demonstrations of such numbers of people and get enormous numbers of petitions with enormous numbers of signatures that would demonstrate that they basically had the support of the people, that Chartism was more of a representative political body than Parliament itself. Okay? And it was hoped that moral argument, that moral display of numbers, would convince Parliament and the reforms would be had. But if that wasn't the case, then they reserved the right, and some reserved the right more than others, to use force, to use physical force in order to achieve reform. Now, Chartism is at the peak of its strength basically in the years 1838 to 1842. In terms of the numbers of organizations around the country that send representatives to the National Charter Association, which was an annual meeting of basically representatives of local charters. You can see here from the size of the petitions that 1842, when they collect 3.3 million signatures, is really the height of their petitioning activity. And you see in this rather grimy map where the main areas of Chartist organisation were. And they pretty neatly map on to the areas of most rapid industrialisation. South Wales, the Midlands, the industrial northwest, the industrial northeast, and the Clyde Valley up around Glasgow. One of the key things about Chartism is that it's organisationally quite innovative. It has this National Charter Association where delegates are sent from local committees every year, and it has a campaigning newspaper owned by its leader, Fergus O'Connor. Should have put that name on the board, but it's a pretty easy one to spell, Fergus O'Connor. He's the figurehead of the movement. There are lots of Chartist leaders, but Fergus O'Connor is really chief amongst them all. And the Northern Star is selling about 50,000 copies a week, and as I said to you last week, most newspapers around this time are getting read by at least 30 other people. So if if you want to get a guide to how many people are reading it, do the math. This is an image of the Chartists presenting the famous petition of 1842. Okay, and you get the point that I'm trying to make here about the dramatic size of the petition here, with all the paper with everyone's signatures on it, and the size of the procession leading down to Parliament. Again, physically enacting how representative and popularly endorsed their movement was. Remember, at this time, there's an electorate of something like 600,000 people. Only 600,000 people. And here we're talking about a petition of 3.3 million. So clearly, Chartism is a more representative political organisation than the Houses of Parliament. Okay, now we get to the action of 1848 itself. Here is a very famous photograph, one of the first photographs, indeed I think the first photograph of a mass outdoor political meeting, and where the big Chartist rally in April 1848 is held in Kennington Common after the meeting of the National Convention of Chartists. So Kennington Common in London. Anyone know where Kennington Common is in London? It's the home of something now very famous. Yes. Yes, indeed. It's the Oval Cricket Ground. Yeah. Any cricket fans in the room? Yeah. Any rugby fans? Anyone excited about the birth of the Rugby World Cup? No? I can give you that information later. Actually, I can give you now. I think Sewell's has a big sign up saying they're going to be showing the Rugby World Cup, which is on Shattuck, up by the so-called gourmet ghetto. Anyway, let's get back to Kennington Common. So there's this big meeting. Chartists have this big mass meeting. They claim that they've got 6 million signatures on their petition, and the aim is that they're going to process it to Parliament, just as in 1842. And 50 to 100,000 people are meant to have met at Kennington Common. But the government reacts with force. It hires, it bans the procession. It says, I'm sorry, you can't possibly bring this petition down to Parliament. And it brings in, as well as its regular police, 150,000 special constables. That's regular, civilians who basically volunteer for some money to be a policeman for the day. Nice work if you can get it. 150,000 special constables and 8,000 soldiers are brought on the streets of London. And infamously, it's raining. They face the full force of the military and the special constables, and the crowd basically disperses. And this is a cartoon which is basically saying, the writing is so bad, but basically the guy is saying, look, I'm going to head home for a cup of tea. This is all got out of hand. That's rather disappointing. But, so basically 1848 ends up as something of a huge disappointment. So how do we explain the fact that people return home to have a cup of tea rather than to confront the full force of the British state in 1848? First thing that I want to say is that despite this mythology of Britain having a small state, remember Macaulay's History of England, actually some people have suggested that the British state in 1848 was the strongest in Europe. It had a centralised police force. It was happy to use its army on the streets, and it was happy to move troops around the country by the new railway system. During the Chartist uprisings, the police used the new telegraph and railway system in order to get news to where the troops should be sent. It was the first sort of very innovative use of that type of technology. And they engaged in the mass arrest, imprisonment, and sometimes deportation of the principal leaders. So the state's policy was always to so-called cut the head off the top of the movement through arrests, imprisonments, and deportation, hoping that would kill the movement. The only point of armed insurrection in the Chartist movement was the rather tragic Newport Rising in South Wales in Newport in 1839, when thousands of Chartists were defeated by just 30 soldiers with muskets, leaving 22 of the protesters dead. And one of the big issues here is whether Chartism fails because of the strength of the British state and the strength of its use of repressive measures, or the organisational weakness of Chartism itself. That Chartism basically didn't have an effective leadership or an organisation capable of responding with the same type of sophistication to the transfer of information and bodies in the way that the state could. The other argument here, so that's two arguments that you've got: strong state, hopeless Chartism. Third argument is that the Chartists were disarmed by a process of reform. Okay, and that after 1840, the 1840s see a whole series of measures designed to take the wind out of the sails of the Chartist movement. So you have the repeal of the Corn Laws, of course, in 1846. You get new factory acts passed in 1847 and 1850, and you get the Public Health Act passed in 1848. Don't worry if you don't get the things down, because I'll be coming back to those later. So that the social conditions of working people, it was argued, were improved by the reforms by the governments of the 1840s. Okay. Any questions on the failed Chartist revolt of 1848 or of Chartism more generally? No? Yeah? It took a long while. You get the secret ballot in 1872. You get universal male suffrage basically in 1918. Payment of MPs, I think, comes in, actually, that's embarrassing, I don't know the specific date for that, early 20th century. Equal electoral districts never comes in. And annual parliament obviously never comes in. So, you know, I mean, there are big reforms in 1867 and 1884 that enfranchise more people, but basically most then don't get the vote until 1918. There's always a big fuss, as we know in California, about redistricting, because we know why redistricting happens. Right, let's move on to a different type of redistricting, the revolt in India. And I must stop using this dreadful word of backstory. It's just something that any historian that uses the word backstory to describe what it is that they do should really be shot. So I'll try and stop it. But let me give you a little bit of the context of the British in India in order for you to be able to understand the conditions in which the revolt or rebellion took place. The East India Company had been this joint stock chartered company that had effectively became a de facto government of Bengal after the Battle of Plassey in 1756. So you have a trading company, very bizarrely, becoming a sovereign form of power. In 1773, the governing forms of the East India Company are placed under parliamentary scrutiny, and that is when Parliament has a role in the appointment of the